The house was asleep, but her heart was not. Grace tossed and turned in bed, searching for a moment of rest that stubbornly eluded her. The clock showed almost 3 in the morning. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and the soft sound only intensified the silence within. She stared at the dark ceiling and felt the weight of the hours. It was as if time dragged on cruelly, reminding her that no one was waiting for her the next day. The cold of dawn seeped in through the cracks in the window, and with it came memories, old, insistent, painful. A sob escaped her. She muffled it in her pillow, as she did every night, afraid the neighbors would hear. No one could see that small yet profound pain that only widows know, the kind of pain that doesn't scream, it just stays. On the bedside table, the Bible lay open. The yellowed pages seemed to hold the promises that had once comforted her, but which now seemed distant, almost unreal. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Sir, why did you leave me alone?" But there was no response, only the continuous ticking of the clock, marking the time of a weary soul. The following morning, the sun timidly entered through the window, streaking light across the worn floor of the room. Grace walked slowly, leaning on her cane, and stopped in front of the table. There it was, his chair, the usual place, property, untouched, the same since the day he left. She ran her hand along the wooden backrest, as if touching a memory. She closed her eyes and could almost hear the sound of his voice, that gentle way he used to call her over for coffee. But it was just the wind. The wind passed by, making the footsteps creak, as if the house also missed them. He sat down in front of the chair, too afraid to move it. It was the last vestige of a routine that no longer existed. 2 cups rested on the sideboard, one clean, the other still stained with old coffee. She never washed it. She said the smell was all that remained of him. The clock on the wall kept the same slow pace as the night before. Nothing changed, and that emptiness before her was more than absence. It was too much presence. The presence of something that was and will not return. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears, but the longing cannot be contained. It escapes, soft and firm, like the thread of a forgotten prayer. The clock on the wall continued to mark the time with a dry, steady sound. Tick-tack, tick-tack. It was the only sound of life in that house. For Grace, each tick was a reminder that the days were going on, even when she no longer had any reason to count the hours. She remembered when time flowed more freely, when her husband was still alive and their laughter filled the air. Now, time was weighing heavily on us. It was like an unsettling presence, reminding her that life didn't stop, even if hers had stopped inside. Sometimes she would stop in front of the clock, watching the hands turn with cruel patience. I thought about how many days had passed since their last hug, since his last word. He tried to remember the voice, the touch, the smell. But memory also ages, and that hurt more than anything. The clock relentlessly marked the rhythm of a loneliness that seemed endless. And she, tired, murmured, "Sir, has time passed for me too? Or only for him?" But the clock didn't respond. He simply continued on, faithful to his craft, to record what remains of a life when love becomes a memory. That late afternoon, the sun streamed through the window, drawing golden lines on the antique wardrobe in the bedroom. Grace slowly opened the wooden doors, and the air filled with a forgotten scent, a mixture of old cologne, talcum powder, and longing. Inside, his clothes were still folded, as if he were coming back at any moment. She picked up a blue shirt, his favorite one, and brought it up to her face. The fabric no longer had the same feel, but the scent still lingered. Light, almost invisible, like a memory that refuses to fade. That aroma was more than just a smell, it was a presence. And as she inhaled, she felt her heart clench in a way that was both sweet and painful at the same time. The tears came slowly, streaming down his wrinkled face. She sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her shirt, and let the tears flow, without hiding them. It was as if each tear washed away a bit of the accumulated time, the time that grief had trapped inside her. Between sobs, she spoke softly, almost in a whisper. I can still feel you here. I can still feel you, my old man. And for a moment, the room seemed to breathe with her. The wind that entered through the window moved the curtain, and the fabric swayed slightly, like a silent response. As evening approached, the distant sound of church bells lingered. Grace stood at the window, watching the shadows stretch across the living room floor. It was the time he usually came home from work, smiling, with the newspaper under his arm and the same "I'm home, my love" that made her heart blossom. Now, that echo lived only in memory, vivid but wounded. The memories sometimes hurt her. They came like sharp points, reminding him of what he had lost, of what he couldn't say, of the time that would never return. But at other times they were like a worn blanket. They provided warmth, tenderness, and gave some meaning to the silence. She walked over to the picture frame on the piece of furniture. The photo of the two of them, taken on their wedding anniversary, showed a smile she could no longer imitate. His gaze, firm and sweet, still seemed to say what it always said: "I'll take care of you." She ran her finger slowly across the glass of the frame, as if trying to touch the past. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't cry. She just stood there, quiet, with a lump in her throat and an open heart, wounded but alive, remembering him, hurt. But to forget would be to die a little more. Grace's mornings were always the same lukewarm coffee, the same plate of bread cut in half, the same old radio that she only turned on to hear a voice. Loneliness had become routine, a sequence of gestures that seemed to keep her alive, but without life. She swept the yard, even though there was almost nothing to clean. She made the bed carefully, as if expecting a visitor who never came. And then he would sit in the armchair, staring into nothingness, while time slipped slowly through his fingers, like sand. Sometimes I tried to read the Bible, but the letters trembled before his tired eyes. Other times, she would just stare at the crucifix on the wall, the same one her husband had put there on their wedding day in the small neighborhood church. There, in silence, she searched for something she no longer knew how to name. The clock ticked the hours, the light changed color, the birds came and went. Everything followed the same rhythm day after day, without surprises, without hugs, without a voice. It was like living in suspended time, the body present, the heart absent. And yet, deep down, something within her was still waiting. I was waiting without knowing what, without knowing when, but I was hoping. From the iron gate, Grace watched the people hurrying by. Cars, voices, laughter, full shopping bags, a world that kept turning without her. Before, neighbors would stop to chat. Now they just waved from afar, with that polite smile that lasts a second and then fades. There was a girl who lived next door and who sometimes brought cake at Christmas. But in this last year, not even that happened. People were always busy, and she learned not to wait. Waiting hurt more than the silence. One afternoon, a ball fell into his yard. A boy jumped over the wall and apologized, not knowing who she was. She returned the ball with a shy smile, and the boy thanked her quickly. He left before she could say, "Stay a little longer, my son." When the gate closed, the yard became quiet again. The echo of children's laughter still lingered in the air, mingled with the distant sounds of the street. For a moment, she remembered the time when the house was full of voices, the children running around, her husband calling for lunch. Now, all that remained was the wind sweeping away dry leaves. The neighborhood was thriving. She simply existed. And yet, every day, she looked out the window, just to make sure the world was still out there. That morning, getting out of bed was a battle. Grace's body no longer obeyed her as before. Her legs trembled, she was breathless, and the mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized. Time had taken away the steadiness of his hands, the sparkle in his eyes, and almost all his strength. But what hurt the most was the inner weariness. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor for long minutes. There was no rush, there was no destination. Everything about her seemed heavy. Even breathing was a weary gesture. He tried to make coffee, but the pot slipped from his hand. The hot liquid spilled across the table, and she stood there, gazing at the minor disaster as one contemplates the inevitable. Then he sighed deeply, wiped it with the cloth, and murmured, "I'm no longer good for anything." The words echoed softly, but they hurt deeply. It was at that moment that he realized something. It wasn't just his body that was weakening. It was a soul. That silent part that once believed, dreamed, hoped. Now it could only endure. She crawled to the window and looked up at the sky. The clouds moved slowly, steady, light, free, and she, standing there motionless, wished for a moment to be like them, part of something greater, untouchable, sustained by a love that never tires. But the sky did not answer. Only the wind blew gently, like a gesture of tenderness that she still didn't understand. That night, Grace tried to pray. As he had done for so many years, he knelt beside the bed, even though he had difficulty. Their trembling hands intertwined slowly, and their lips began to form familiar words, ancient prayers, repeated since their youth. But before she could finish the first sentence, her voice broke. The crying came softly, like someone asking for permission. First, a stifled sob, then a cry that filled the room with heartfelt sounds. There was no one to hear, but even so she cried as if someone could listen. The words she wanted to say were lost in the tears. All that remained was the fragile sound of pain, a formless lament made of longing, fear, and weariness. She wasn't asking for anything anymore. She didn't know what to ask for. "I just wanted to feel that God still saw her, that he still remembered her name. I don't know how to pray anymore, Lord," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "But you know what's inside me." Then silence, a heavy silence, but also a sacred one, as if heaven itself inclined its ear to listen to her, not through words but through tears. She remained there, kneeling, until her body gave out. And when he lay down, his face still wet, he fell asleep whispering, "Listen to me, just listen to me, Jesus." The following days were filled with a silence that seemed to come from within. Not even the sound of birds could distract her anymore. Grace looked out the window at the sky and saw only clouds passing by. No message, no answer, no sign. She still prayed, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in her thoughts. But everything seemed to echo in the void. The words went out, but nothing came back. And that nothing hurt more than grief, more than loneliness. It was as if God had turned away from her, or perhaps had grown tired of her. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, she whispered, "If the Lord is listening to me, why doesn't he say anything?" The breeze blew at that very moment, but she didn't even notice. She was too tired to notice the small signs, the gentle gestures of the divine that still surrounded her. The neighbors hurried past, children laughed in the distance, and life went on. But within her soul, everything was winter. No more tears came. The pain no longer cried. It only weighed heavily. She began to think that perhaps that was indeed the case. Perhaps God only spoke to those who still had the strength to listen, and she just wanted to sleep all day and not wake up with that emptiness. The sky remained still, but there was something in the silence, something that was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That night, the weariness seemed even deeper. Grace didn't even have the strength to kneel. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap, staring into nothingness. The room was dark, and the distant sound of the street was the only sign of life around. Her heart felt tight, as if something inside was begging to get out. A silent scream, an old pain that wouldn't dissolve. Her eyes welled up with tears, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, slow and silent. It wasn't a cry of despair, but of surrender. It was as if the body was saying what the soul could no longer formulate. "Sir, I can't take it anymore." And that tear fell onto her hand, warm, alive, small. But that was enough, because sometimes God doesn't need words. A sincere tear is enough to hear the whole heart. For a moment the air seemed different. There was something in the room, something soft, light, almost imperceptible, like a breath. She didn't see it, but she felt it. and without understanding why, he took a deep breath and murmured, "If the Lord is still there, don't leave me alone tonight." Then he closed his eyes. There was no response, but there was no more fear either. Dawn arrived silently, shrouded in a chill that seeped in through the cracks in the window. Grace woke up with a heavy chest, without understanding why. It was as if something inside her was asking for it, not an explanation, but for her presence. She looked at the dark ceiling and without planning began to speak. The words came out broken, between short breaths. "Lord, if you still see me, if you still remember me, I just wanted to feel your love again." The voice failed, but the prayer continued within her, silent, formless, made only of feeling. I wasn't asking for health. He didn't ask for company. She was only asking for comfort. A touch, a sign, anything that would say that heaven still knew her. She remained like that for minutes that seemed like an eternity, until the crying came again. This time, it wasn't sadness. It was as if the soul opened up, emptying itself of everything that had weighed it down for so long, and the more she cried, the lighter she felt. Outside, the wind began to blow stronger. The curtains moved slowly and the lamp flickered for a moment. The air in the room seemed to come alive, and without realizing it, Grace stopped crying, not because the pain had ended, but because something new was beginning to blossom within her. The room was bathed in dim light, and the silence was so profound it felt like breathing. Grace remained still, too weak to move, but something invisible, began to fill the space. It wasn't wind, it wasn't a memory, it was a presence. She opened her eyes slowly. The air felt different, lighter, warmer, as if someone had entered there without making a sound. A soft perfume, whose origin she didn't know, spread through the room. The scent of flowers, of damp earth, of peace. Her heart raced. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, but there was something too real in that instant, something the whole body recognized. It wasn't imagination, it was presence. Tears began to well up again, but now they weren't from pain. It was something else entirely, a mixture of wonder and tenderness. She saw no one, and yet she felt a silent, profound love that enveloped her completely. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "Is that you, sir?" And at that exact moment, the air seemed to respond, not with words, but with peace, a peace that did not come from this world. Time seemed to stand still. Grace felt her heart beating slowly, as if each beat could be heard by someone very close to her. The room was serene, enveloped in a dim light that she couldn't explain. It didn't come from the lamp, nor from the street. It was a soft, vibrant light, as if the air itself had become a glow. That's when he heard. Not a loud sound, nor a voice coming from outside. It was a whisper inside her, sweet, deep, full of tenderness. Grace. She stood motionless. Breathing failed. No one had called her that in a long time. With affection, with care, with truth. And that voice. It was unlike any other. There was no burden, no guilt, no demand, just love. Her name rang out again, even softer, like wind touching flowers. "Grace, I'm here." Her body trembled. The tears returned, now light, warm, and clean. She brought her hands to her face and murmured between sobs, "I knew it. I knew the Lord hadn't forgotten me." At that moment, all the emptiness that had accompanied her for years began to give way. Not because things had changed outside, but because someone, was now inside her. Tears were still flowing, but they were no longer tears of pain. And as she wept, something gentle happened, something so real that she held her breath, fearing that if she moved, everything would disappear. A tenderness descended upon her, as if invisible hands were enveloping her in an embrace. There was no weight, only warmth, a warmth that didn't burn, but healed. It started at the shoulders, went down to the chest, and filled the empty space where fear once resided. Grace felt as if someone had sat down beside her on the bed. There was no form, no figure, but there was presence. A presence that gazed at her without eyes, that touched her without hands, and yet she knew it was him. Time ceased to exist. The room disappeared, and all that remained was that touch, gentle, constant, alive, that seemed to say without words, "I never left you. I was always here." She closed her eyes and her tears turned to laughter, a timid laugh mixed with sobs, like that of a child comforted after much fear. And for the first time in so many years, her chest felt light, so light it seemed like it could float. The touch lasted as long as the heart needed. Then it didn't go away. It simply transformed into peace. And she remained quiet, with a fragile smile on her lips, repeating silently, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you for not forgetting me." Grace continued crying, but this cry was different. There was no despair, no loneliness. It was a gentle, sweet, liberating weeping. Each tear that fell seemed to wash away an old weight, a bitter memory, a guilt kept deep in the heart. She cried and smiled. She felt as if a fountain had opened up inside her, washing away the dark corners of her soul, those where pain had resided for so long. It was as if Jesus silently passed through her, collecting one by one the tears that the world had never seen. The whole body became still. The air in the room seemed to breathe along with her, calm, measured, full of presence. And for the first time she understood that that touch had not come to erase the pain, but to transform what it meant. Each tear that fell now shone in the soft light, as if it had been purified, and amidst her tears she whispered softly, "Now I know, Lord, now I know I was never alone." She remained like that for many minutes, until the crying had run dry. A wet face, trembling hands, a clean heart, and deep in my heart, a new silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of peace. Dawn found Grace still sitting on the bed, but now something was different. The air was light, and her face radiated a serenity that the mirror hadn't seen in a long time. That old pain, which had resided between his shoulders and chest, had dissipated, not disappeared, but transformed. She took a deep breath and realized she could do it effortlessly. It was as if he had learned to breathe again, but with his soul. The heart, which had previously been tight, now beat calmly, without haste, as if it had finally found the right rhythm. He looked around the room, the same chair, the same Bible on the bedside table. Nothing had changed on the outside, but inside everything was new. The weight that had prevented her from living had vanished like mist in the sun. He stood up slowly. Each movement seemed like a silent prayer. He gave thanks without words, only with his gaze turned to the sky. And without quite understanding, she began to hum an old hymn that her husband liked, softly between laughter and tears. It was the same woman, but with a different heart. A heart touched, supported, loved, and deep in my soul, a simple, luminous, unwavering certainty, Jesus stayed. As morning dawned outside, Grace sat down at the table and looked at the empty chair in front of her. For so many years, that space had been a mirror of the emptiness within her, but on that day, something changed. She felt no more pain. Yes, she felt homesick, but it was a serene, cleansed homesickness, without despair. The smell of coffee spread through the kitchen. She placed 2 cups on the table, as she used to do in the past, not out of illusion, but out of gratitude, because now she knew the love that once filled that house had not died. He had simply transformed, returning in the form of presence, in the form of peace. As she drank her coffee, she remembered the laughter, the conversations, the sunny afternoons with her husband, and she felt, tenderly, that each memory was a gift, not a wound. Everything they had experienced had been cared for, preserved, and sanctified by time and mercy. The tears came again, but this time they were calm. Tears from someone who finally remembered that she was still loved. Not only for those who have departed, but for the one who never left. Grace smiled to herself, gazing at the emptiness that was no longer empty, and he said in a low voice, almost in a whisper, "I am loved, and the Lord is still here." The sun streamed in through the window with a gentleness she had never noticed before. The rays of light touched the table, the floor, Grace's face, and everything seemed more alive, simpler, more beautiful. It was the same dawn as every day, but inside her it was the first of a new life. She opened the front door and felt the wind touch her face. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The air smelled of morning, of hope, of beginnings. The trees in the backyard swayed gently, and the birds sang a chorus that seemed to greet her back. For a moment she thought, how could I not have noticed before? The Lord has always been here, in the birdsong, in the breeze, in the flowers, in the silence. And she smiled, because now I knew how to see, not with the weary eyes of the body, but with the cleansed eyes of the soul. He picked up the Bible from the balcony and opened it at random. Her gaze fell upon a verse that seemed to have been left there just for her. I will be with you every day. Grace closed the book slowly, her hands trembling, and sighed. Everything was the same as the day before, the house, the memories, the world, but her heart had awakened first. The afternoon slowly descended upon the house. The sky was painted in shades of orange, and a warm light streamed in through the windows, spreading calm over everything. Grace was sitting in her old armchair, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze lost somewhere between the horizon and her heart. There was no hurry, no pain, no fear. Time, which once weighed like a stone, now flowed lightly like still water. She knew her body was getting weaker a little more each day, but that no longer scared her, because the soul, that soul, was whole, firm, resting in a peace that did not come from this world. The clock still told the hours, but she no longer kept track of time. She was where she had always wanted to be, within the presence she had once sought while crying. That presence that enveloped her, that called her by name, that taught her to live again. With her gaze fixed on the sunset, she murmured softly, "Stay with me, Jesus. Stay until the end." And it was as if the wind itself answered, gently brushing his face. She closed her eyes, and a slight smile formed. It wasn't the end. It was rest. Rest in the presence of the one who remains. The house remained the same walls, the same garden, the same clock marking the time. But something invisible had been transformed forever. Where once the echo of solitude dwelt, now resided a silence filled with presence. On cold nights the wind still blew, but it no longer seemed empty. It was as if each breeze brought a gentle reminder. He stayed. Grace no longer cried as much as before. The tears had become silent prayers, not of pain, but of gratitude. And when she closed her eyes, she felt that same gentle touch in her heart, reminding her that the love of Jesus never leaves, never grows old, never falls silent. Outside, the sun was setting slowly. Inside, a light remained on. It wasn't the end of the story. It was a rest, the peace that arrives and decides to stay, a presence that never goes away. Jesus, still there, always wings.